Hello, I'm Zonalfair and welcome to another video on the Tech Quest. It's no secret that I really like handheld PCs. With the exception of a couple of newer models, I've owned almost all of them at some point, starting from the Steam Deck, then the ROG Ally, and then to the Legion Go S and so on. They're one of the few devices I use daily without fail. But all are not created equal, and each of them has their own positives and negatives. For the last 4 months, I've been using the MSI Claw A1M, decently designed machine with some interestingly flawed hardware behind it. I stumbled across this Legion Go S for an absolute bargain, even though I wasn't in the market for one, despite being sold to me as second hand. This Legion was brand new in the box. I paid £300 for the 512GB Windows 11 model, which is around about the same price you can pick up the previously mentioned Claw at the moment. I'm not doing a direct comparison today, but it is going to be relevant a little later. Anyway, let's get to it. The Legion Go S features the AMD Ryzen Z2 Go, a 4-core, 8-thread processor with a base speed of 3 GHz, moving up to 4.3 GHz on boost when conditions allow. It features 8 MB of R3 cache and is based on the Zen 4 CPU architecture. On the GPU side, the Legion features Radeon graphics based on RDNA 2, with 12 graphics cores to push out games to the Legion Go's massive 8-inch 120Hz screen, and this model has 16GB of DDR5 6400 memory. Although you can buy models with 32GB of memory, this is actually slower than the stuff found in the original Legion Go S. The slower speed means you can achieve higher capacity at the price of some performance. It's not the best trade-off when our GPUs are so sensitive to memory speed in my opinion, but it is what it is. It has two USB 4 Type-C ports and can be connected to a dock for use on a TV. With a 55Wh battery, the Legion Go S should be able to go some time on battery power when you're out and about. Storage expansion is provided by one SD card slot placed at the bottom of the machine rather than right next to the power port like last time. So that's a good decision right there in my opinion. You'll also notice one of the Z1E's features has gone. The detachable controllers are now no longer detachable. I prefer this kind of design, but obviously this is subjective and some might be disappointed by that change. I'm not. Enough about the hardware for now, let's get on to the games. I've connected the Legion Go S up to an external dock and all footage has been captured using a separate PC, so what you see here is what you will get. For testing, I have set the Legion in 40W DC mode, so this is absolute best case scenario for performance. Without further delay, let's get to it. At 1080p medium, New Vegas is best described as just okay. It kept 60 FPS most of the time, but there were momentary drops into the low 50s that I honestly did not expect. Vegas is quite an old game, and I would have expected the Legion to walk all over this, but instead it just performed adequately. We're not off to a great start, are we? Cyberpunk 2077 ran well enough. At 720p and using the Steam Deck preset, the Legion managed absolutely fine here, and the game was plenty playable enough with a frame rate that hovered around the 30 to 40 FPS range. There were some inconsistencies in the frame rate when you were driving around Night City, and I'd consider capping this to 30 FPS for a smoother overall experience. Higher frames are a little pointless when they cause drops to lower frames anyway. Cap it to 30 and you'll get plenty of enjoyment here. Spider-Man was actually pretty good. At 1080p and using the very low preset, I also set FSR to balanced here as well. The Legion held the 30 FPS target here very well, and it was really playable overall. We saw mostly low 30s in game, but the important thing was that it was consistent and didn't really deviate too much from that number, so you'll have a really enjoyable experience that also looks pretty good too. Not bad at all. Red Dead Redemption 2 was a similar story. At 720p low, the Legion delivered again with plenty playable results. Towns such as Valentine would see a 30 FPS or so frame rate, but out on horseback in the Wild West would net you around 55 FPS. This was decent to play despite the low quality settings. I recorded this footage in docked mode, but most will simply stick to that 8-inch screen, and to be fair to the Legion, that screen will hide a lot of the lower quality sacrifices you'll have to make to keep that frame rate up. Borderlands 2 is next. This is an older game, and one I would expect any of these handhelds to run at 1080p. Using the medium settings, the Legion was fine, but it just didn't feel as smooth as it should have done, with regular drops into the mid-40s when a lot was going on. I was a little disappointed by this result, so even though it is more than playable, it wasn't where I expected it to be. This is when I grabbed my trusty MSI Claw and loaded up Borderlands 2 on it for comparison. Well, what can I say here? The 155H ARC-based Claw had absolutely no problems with wiping the floor with the Legion, even though ARC performance in older games isn't Intel's strong point. These two machines can be found for around the same price today, and I would have expected the Radeon-based machine to take the crown here. It didn't. Moving on, Red Dead Redemption 1 ran great. At 1080p and using the medium settings, Red Dead managed a solid 60 FPS on the Legion Go S, with trips into the towns taking us down into the 50s as CPU load increased. Something not unique to the Legion, and what I would expect on most lower end hardware. You'll notice throughout my testing today that I do have VSync on, and this is actually by design. Screen tearing while docked was pretty bad, and for the few extra frames on very rare occasions, I felt it wasn't worth the screen tearing it came with. So I elected for playability today rather than maximum frames, which it really didn't do very often anyway. I won't make you wait any longer. Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced now. At 1080p, I let the Legion Go decide the best settings here, which turned out to be normal right across the board. Here the Legion managed absolutely fine, with a 40 FPS range in the downtown area of Los Santos, increasing up to near 60 when you left the city and got to the more rural areas. It was perfectly okay overall, even though it didn't look particularly great. I'm going to pull some footage from my MSI Claw review again for comparison here though, and as you can see, the MSI Claw once again takes a crown over the Legion Go S, and these machines cost about the same today. Left 4 Dead 2 was great. At 1080p and with all the settings maxed out, there's no cause for complaint here from the Legion. There could be very occasional dips from the 60 FPS target, but these were quite rare and won't impact your performance, no matter how busy things get in the zombie apocalypse. Speaking of zombie apocalypse, personal favourite of mine, Dying Light now. At 1080p medium, the Legion delivered a good experience overall, although we were well short of the 60 FPS mark I aimed for. There were occasional dips into the 30s when things got hectic, especially in the city area, but the Legion kept going to provide a satisfying zombie experience. I could play like this absolutely fine. Final direct comparison with the MSI Claw again today, and it's exactly as we have already seen with the MSI Claw outpacing the Legion by some margin again. If you haven't already, I'll leave a link at the end of this video on my full MSI Claw review so you can compare the rest of the titles tested today. Counter-Strike 2 was just okay. At 1080p low, you'll get by absolutely fine on casual game modes, but you'd certainly be at a disadvantage if you were playing CS2 competitively. It managed 60 FPS and above a lot, but there were frequent drops into the mid-40s that would be a deal breaker for competitive play. The limiting factor here is definitely the processor, and I do wonder why they didn't opt for a 6 or 8 core mobile part. AMD make plenty of them after all, and they can't be a million miles away in price either. The Precinct is a nice little game I've been enjoying a lot lately, and it runs pretty good on the Legion overall. At 1080p and using the low preset with FSR, the Legion hovered around the 30 FPS mark, although there was the very occasional stutter as you traversed the city in the cop car. Wasn't a deal breaker though, and I had an enjoyable experience on the Legion Go S. Our penultimate game today, The Last of Us. At 1080p low, the game's render resolution was much lower of course, around 360p, but it actually performed pretty well. Even at that lower render resolution, the game looked fine, and coming back again to the Legion's screen, it will certainly look much better than what you see presented here from a dock. I played this originally on a Steam Deck a couple of years back, and this was more than good enough then and now, and actually better than the MSI Claw achieved when I tested it a while ago, so credit where it is due, as long as you're not keeping score. And finally, Frostpunk. At 720p low, the Legion had no problems at all running another one of my favourites, although realistically this is quite a unique use case for the Legion. I like testing this one as it's quite hard on GPUs, as well as being awesome, and it had no issues here at all. Pretty great. And that's a wrap for today. First of all, I'd just like to make clear that today's conclusion is on the Legion Go S with Windows 11. There is a SteamOS version of this machine, but I do not have that available for testing, and performance on that is supposed to be much improved over this Windows 11 version. There's a lot to talk about today, so let's start with overall game performance. Honestly, it's disappointing. All of the games tested today play fine, but there's just something off with performance in most of them. I'm a huge fan of the Legion Go Z1E. I used one daily for 16 months and it went everywhere with me, but I can't say the same for the Legion Go S. I'm more likely to take my MSI Claw out with me, as overall it is the better performing machine. Games on the Legion Go S didn't hit 60 FPS very often at 1080p, which means you'd have to lower the resolution to reach that target. Something which feels entirely at odds with the Legion's massive 8-inch high-resolution screen. It just doesn't make sense. And then there's a fan noise. Lenovo were very conservative with the default fan speed on the Legion Z1E. And look, I understand from a hardware point of view, these things run hot and Lenovo would rather err on the side of caution here. I get it. The problem is that the fan speed is very noisy, especially when you set the machine into high performance mode. There are fan presets, but it just doesn't solve how audible the noise actually is under any kind of load. When you're browsing and streaming, the Legion can be fairly quiet, but once you ask something of it, that changes completely. It really impacts the experience, especially when you consider this thing sits in your hands. As for user comfort, it is pretty comfortable. The machine is large due to that screen, but it's fairly lightweight and does stand up to extended play quite well as the weight is well distributed. I personally still prefer my claw from a handheld perspective, but that is of course entirely subjective. I do appreciate the Legion's comfort though, and Lenovo have done a decent job of it in my opinion. Battery life is also pretty good, with a full charge lasting around 2 hours or so in 20 watt mode. You can also configure that power draw to match your usage, something I really liked on the Z1E, and like again on the Legion Go S. If you're just streaming, drop the machine to 10 watts and get even longer on that battery. Overall, the Legion Go S is an odd one to really call it either way. On one hand, it's comfortable, well designed, and very customizable to your individual use. It's also fairly cheap, and that screen is pretty excellent, even if Lenovo are being very over optimistic about the high resolutions you can set for your games. Ultimately though, I'm judging on its performance today, which is frankly mediocre at best. The processor feels underpowered, and the 16 gigs of RAM gets quickly eaten up to the point that I feel these things should have 32 as standard. Game performance is in line with the original Steam Deck kind of, but that's something that's been out for years. Then there's a similarly priced claw. Intel have been hard at work on drivers, and they're now at a point where the ARC-based graphics on the 155H often handily outperform the Legion Go S on the games I play, albeit at higher power usage. If you want to spend around £350 on a handheld PC, I'd suggest looking on the used market for a Legion Go Z1E. It's a great piece of kit that will surprise you with how good it is. If you must buy new, then consider the Steam Deck for around the same price. If you must have Windows, then I'd seriously consider the MSI Claw A1M155H, although that's not quite the perfect recommendation either, and depends entirely on the price. There is also a SteamOS version of the Legion Go S, and that does appear to have reviewed quite well if you still want a Legion Go S, and you aren't fussed about using Windows 11. The Legion Go S isn't a bad machine. There's a lot I do like about it, but its pricing is a problem when there are more performant alternatives for the same kind of money. Drop it another 50 quid, making it cheaper than a Steam Deck, and it does start to become a more attractive proposition. It really is one of those machines that I can't quite recommend either way. Anyway, that's it for today. I've been Zone of Air, and thank you very much for watching. Until next time, bye bye.